Hello guys! Isn't it weird how I've made 6 Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom tracks, but I've never had a chance to actually talk about any of them? Well, I want to change that, so today I'm going to talk about how I made my first Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom track, Nabbit's Secret Island. I first released this track in September of 2022, but I made several major updates for it as recently as 2024. Though, because of Nintendo's copyright takedowns, none of the videos showing these updates are still public. What first prompted me to start making a Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom track was the release of Cloudy Super Mario Bros. U 2, since I'd been modding New Super Mario Bros. U for 5 years at that point and wanted to try out something different. I'd already messed around with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe modding for some time, since I'd been helping out my friend Maker with his ported retro tracks. In order to start working on my own track, I followed Squadaloo's custom track creation tutorial series, which he was in the process of releasing around the same time. I had almost zero experience working with Blender or 3D modeling in general, so Squadaloo's slow and deliberate explanations were exactly what I needed. It was also this early on that I made my first big mistake. See, the tutorial was basically all about making a test track. It didn't cover design, just the process of model importing and working with track objects and that sort of stuff. So the smart thing to do after making my own test track would have been to then put some effort into actually designing something with thought put into it, and making a proper track out of that. Instead, the mistake I made was actually turning my test track, just about the very first thing I'd ever modeled at that point, into a fully fledged custom track, without thinking about its design much at all really. So if you're looking at this footage and are wondering, why is this turn so sharp? Why is that jump kind of blind? Why is the finish line so close to this turn? Why is the track so short? Well, the reason is that I originally designed this layout just to mess around with the Mario Kart 8 track creation process. But then, without thinking about it, I proceeded to spend several weeks turning this into this. And that brings me on to something I did put a bit of thought into: theming. So I knew my track was short. I originally made it 7 laps, and in its current release it has 5 laps, so I wanted the track's theme to justify this decision. In New Super Mario Bros. U, there is this hilariously tiny secret island world with a purple toad house on it, which is implied to be Nabbit's house. So, since my track was tiny, and Nabbit is known for his short, frantic chases across levels, and also I was known for modding New Super Mario Bros. U at the time, I decided to make my track Nabbit's Secret Island. Like I already said, I knew almost nothing about 3D modeling at this point, so if you're wondering how the track went from this to this, well, that was mainly accomplished by manually extruding polygons. This is why, to this day, the track's road and other terrain is kind of bumpy and inconsistent in places, because certain sections like this grass area were really difficult for me to model by hand. When the track first released, I also had no idea how to model cliff faces, so all of the track's walls were originally completely flat and straight. Apart from this basic piece of terrain, all of the track's modeling was done by taking assets from the original game's tracks. So these trees are from GBA Mario Circuit, the finish line is from Moo Moo Meadows, this toad house appears on a number of tracks such as Mario Circuit, and even these cliffs were taken from Yoshi Valley. Though at least I managed to make some of these elements feel a bit more unique by implementing custom textures, like with this Yoshi Valley sign at the start. These fences were also taken from Moo Moo Meadows, but I had to rework these quite a lot to fit the track's shape, so that took a relatively large amount of effort. Whenever I was forced to model specific details by hand, I really struggled, which is why elements like the edges of this boost panel originally looked pretty bad. After the track's main island was done, I decided to make its theming a bit more explicit by putting a very simple island with some Acorn Plains assets to the east of this island, which is of course a reference to the island's location on the New Super Mario Bros. U world map. When I finally imported the full track into the game, I made sure to exclusively use materials extracted from the original game's tracks, which is part of the reason why, despite the bad modeling, the track still looked okay even in its original incarnation. Materials, by the way, determine how a model's surface displays its texture and changes depending on lighting, which is why grass has these green highlights, these cliffs feel like they're made of rock, and even this water looks like, well, water. Another reason the track looked decent compared to other beginner custom tracks is because of bake maps. Shadows in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe are handled by these giant textures that tell each surface which part of it is and isn't in shadow depending on the texture's colors. These are created by baking the lighting onto these surfaces in Blender. So instead of forcing the game itself to render these shadows for all of the track's geometry, we're letting an external program do the heavy lifting ahead of time and then store that information in these textures. This baking process is extremely slow and tedious, by the way, because the process of UV mapping these bake map textures, basically telling each model which part of the texture to use for its shadows, can take a long time. And depending on the processing power of your PC, rendering these shadows can take hours upon hours, and that's assuming you didn't mess anything up and have to retry. So this is why some people don't bother making bake maps for their first few custom tracks, which is what makes some custom tracks look very flat. Bake maps aren't just used for shadows technically, they can also be used to apply light to the track's models, but when I first made this track, I barely understood how that process worked. So instead of actually rendering the track's light maps, I just drew this glow effect coming off of the anti-gravity and boost panels onto the bake map texture myself. Compared to the track's visuals, making it actually function was relatively easy. Like most 3D games, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe uses separate models for the collision of its environments, which in the case of this track meant I made a duplicate of the normal model but with some simplified geometry. There are some tricks to collision modeling that I didn't fully grasp when first working on this track. For example, most Mario Kart tracks make the transition between the collision of roads and grass less bumpy than it appears, but I didn't originally bother implementing that. Out of bounds areas can be created using collision, but are usually determined by these big lap path boxes that cover the area the player is allowed to drive in. So even though certain areas of the track aren't properly walled off like they would be in the original game, you still can't go exploring too far off-road. The movement of the CPUs, items, and even steering assistance are all handled by these simple paths that were trivial to implement. And placing other elements like item boxes and NPCs didn't take a lot of effort either. In fact, even though I didn't put a whole lot of thought into where coins and item boxes should go, I still think I managed to capture the feel of Nintendo's usage of these kinds of things better than some much more ambitious custom tracks. Alright, so that was most of what went into the original release of the track back in 2022. A year later, I released an update that added 2 Waddlewinks walking across the roads, which were a Goomba remodel, and a Nabbit NPC standing next to his house, which is a remodel of an Animal Crossing NPC. This update also improved the track's visuals quite substantially, because at this point I'd actually learned how to model, so I redid the track's walls and also re-rendered its bake maps. Then in 2024, after the track was included in CGP Deluxe, I decided to try and actually fix the way it played. A lot of my problems with the track, this awkward anti-gravity turn, this jump which is really rough, especially at 200cc, and the fact that the track as a whole feels pretty cramped, led me to resizing the entire thing. So in its latest iteration, the track is 25% larger than it was originally, and this is also why I reduced its lap count from 7 to 5. I also once again improved the track's visuals in some subtle ways. For example, shadows now actually get cast onto the drivers. But still, even in its current iteration, I don't think the track is amazing. Even though it's what I put the most amount of effort into originally, by my current standards, the theming feels extremely generic, which mainly comes down to how many recycled assets I used. In terms of gameplay, it's also still far from perfect, especially at 200cc. If I wanted to make the track as good as possible whilst keeping the same theme and overall layout, I'd probably make this big circular turn at the start take place inside of Nabbit's house, which would be much larger and allow the player to see inside the house like in New Super Mario Bros. U. Then maybe this jump could go out of a window, with the section of road after that being completely straight, followed by a simple U-turn. This would make the track way less generic from a visual standpoint, whilst also fixing its sharp turns and awkward jump. But actually modeling and implementing that would probably take several weeks of work, and frankly I don't want to spend that kind of time simply revamping one of my old tracks. If I ever go back to making Mario Kart 8 Deluxe mods, I'd much rather make something new than yet another update for this same 3-year-old track. So I think this is it for Nabbit's Secret Island. It's not a great track, but I think it's pretty decent for a first attempt. And that's also it for this video, guys. I'm hoping to make more of these kinds of videos about my other Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom tracks in the future, so in case you'd want to see that, maybe consider letting me know by leaving a like or a comment or subscribing or whatever. I also have a Discord server which is linked in the description, and you can sign up for a channel membership to get early access to my videos. But anyways guys, thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!